Chinese have a word, Luan. Luan means chaos, anarchy. Mao Tse-tung, absolute ruler of China's millions, believed in Luan, but he saw it as a positive force, a force which paradoxically could be organized to produce order. The greater the chaos, the greater the order. In the Cultural Revolution, Mao Tse-tung plunged his country into chaos, assuming that out of it would come the greatest order which China had ever seen. On October 1st, 1949, a new People's Republic of China was proclaimed. Mao Tse-tung had won power by force of arms, proving the truth of his own dictum that power flows from the barrel of the gun. A grim truth for the rest of the world to live with, but one that at least came unencumbered with Marxist dogma. Mao's regime was almost at once recognized by most of the other major powers, with the notable exception of the United States. The Red Star now flew over the country with the largest population in the world, and China experts held their breath as they waited to see what Mao would do next. One of these specialists is Harrison E. Salisbury of the New York Times.
For 6,000 years, China's social structure had hardly changed. Now Mao is in power, and he was going to change it, not everywhere. He was going to change it in the direction of its long existence, but he was going to put the stamp of Maoism on every phase of China's life, particularly on the life of the peasants. He was going to organize them. He was going to transform them from superstitious, illiterate, ill, weak people into powerful people capable of creating a new nation. I don't regard Mao as being a man who was born with a vision. There's no evidence in his youth, his childhood, and his early manhood that he had any great vision of being the Messiah of China. He saw things in a small way, but he learned, even though he learned slowly, and once he became possessed of an idea, he was utterly tenacious in carrying it through. I think that the way Mao did it was to utilize himself as a symbol, the Mao image, the pictures everywhere, the little red book, the badges everyone wore, the quotations, everyone began his sentence with Mao. And Mao was realistic enough and sophisticated enough to be a little embarrassed by this, but he said that, in essence, that with an illiterate people you had to have this living symbol. Things had to be made very simple. They had to see the leader incarnate, and he was willing to give his image for that purpose.
The lever by which Mao intended to move China was the power of her peasant masses. The force behind the lever was the power of hatred. Hatred of the landlord and the moneylender. Hatred organized and controlled for specific ends. Hatred which would be allowed to spend itself in killings, so that the force behind the hatred could be turned to productive communal labor.
We don't really know very much about his crimes. We don't know very much about the people who have lost their lives in China. As Chinese will tell you again and again, Mao taught us not to kill unnecessarily. I don't think, however, that there was much natural cruelty in his makeup. I think there was cruelty in Stalin's makeup. I think Stalin enjoyed being cruel. Mao himself, perhaps because of the Chinese philosophy in which he was so steeped and of which he was such a product, didn't exercise cruelty for the sake of cruelty. He didn't mind using it if it was necessary, but he was not a man who got his kicks that way. He was a man who saw life as being very cruel. He expected, as the Chinese do, that many lives would be lost in any important endeavor. So it had always been in China, and so he expected it would be, and so his own Chinese peasants felt. They felt the same way. But when he could save their lives, as he did through modernizing their life, they responded very, very positively. I don't think he was so interested in saving lives because of humanitarianism as in making China strong. He felt that China could not endure if it continued to be subject to the plagues that had overcome it in the past.
The organization of the peasants was controlled by Mao's army. Instead of browbeating the peasants, as warlords in the past had done, Mao's soldiers took the lead in helping them. Soon the peasants had organized themselves in paramilitary formations. This, at least, is the picture released to the outside world. What the camera shows is the regimentation of a whole people whose wills were no longer their own. No one could escape from that regimentation, not even the youngest.
Many scholars of China feel that the Mao revolution and his concept of where he wanted to move the Chinese people is probably the greatest social change that has ever been attempted in this oldest of all our social organizations. There's no other social organization of human beings that has a continuous history of nearly 8,000 years. And the reason it has had that continuous history is that it has always stayed within certain boundaries. It has never changed very much, very fast. Mao's concept was to move these people away from thousands of years of living arrangements into new ones.
That power flows from the barrel of a gun was a truth for children to learn in Mao's order of things.
He was a great man for examples, and I think that perhaps he was sharpened in that by his training as a schoolmaster at the Changsha Normal School, because when he did come to power, he was forever using parables and illustrations and simple, almost black and white stories, which would carry a meaning to the peasants.
Mao brought no master plan to the task of building up his country. His principal contribution was to try out experiments, which produced conflicts with some of his associates who had the day-to-day job of running China. Mao first encouraged criticism of his regime, but when the criticism grew sharp, he had the most vocal critics suppressed. His next experiment was the Great Leap Forward, a movement for Chinese self-sufficiency. The whole of China was invited to set up small model industries, of a kind ridiculed by outsiders and by some of Mao's colleagues as backyard steel mills. The attempt was a disaster and set back production more than it furthered it. These costly failures reduced Mao's standing among his colleagues. He appeared to be dropping into the background and assuming the role of an elder statesman, while direction of affairs passed into the hands of younger men. But then in 1965, Mao emerged from this apparent retirement to launch what became known as the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution.
Mao probably understood power better than almost any contemporary statesman. He understood it in realistic terms. He fought to get it. When he lost it, he knew he had lost it. And then he fought to get it back again. Power for him was on a scale that is almost inconceivable for any Westerner to understand, because power to him meant the leadership and the movement of an enormous tide of people.
The day after his famous swim in the river, Mao came to Peking and took over the Cultural Revolution. What followed were 4 years of turbulence, anarchy, and occasional civil war in China's cities, factories, and universities. For years, the nation was in such turmoil that production in factories dropped to alarmingly low levels. Only the peasant masses in the army were relatively immune from the struggle. Mao's objectives in promoting this upheaval were not clear, except that certain individuals in the government were driven from office.
He simply couldn't live with him in the last period of his life. Profoundly disagreed with him, and also wanted the power back in his own hands. He'd lost a large hunk of it, and he wanted it back. And he got it back only to see the whole thing. Well, I guess he didn't realize it because he was gaga before he died, but the whole damn thing just really blew up in his own hands after he got it. It was too late. He should have stayed the elder statesman as they wanted him to be. He should have stayed on that shelf. But he wouldn't do it. He came back down for one great last whirl of Luan, that marvelous anarchy and confusion out of which he believed the perfect order was going to emerge. And it was the Luan that really did him in.
Thousands, it is thought, were killed in the Cultural Revolution. According to Mao's doctrine, a greater order should have emerged from the chaos. But to what purpose? Was it only to glorify Mao himself?
Mao summed up his philosophy typically for a Chinese in a poem. So many deeds cry out to be done, and always urgently. The world rolls on, time presses. 10,000 years are too long. Seize the day, seize the hour. The four seas boil, clouds and waters rage. The 5 continents rock in the wind in roaring thunder. Away with all pests, our force is irresistible. And then he said something about what he was going to do with his power, something about killing. The head of a man does not grow like a leek, and once it is cut, another will not come out. If a head is wrongly cut, there would be no way to correct the mistake. He was going to kill, but he was going to kill selectively.
The power of organized chaos joined to the power of hatred made a fearsome combination. Could such a destructive force be contained within China? Mao's victory in October 1949 was grudgingly welcomed by the Soviet Union. Ambassadors between the two communist giants were at once exchanged. In driving Sheng out of the mainland of China, Mao had burned his boats as far as obtaining American aid was concerned. Whether he liked it or not, he had to turn for assistance to the Russians, the big nose men, as Chinese called them.
Chinese think in such long terms, and they think of the end not as we do, in the sense that we have to have the results within 48 hours. That didn't bother him. And when he looked at the Soviet Union or looked at Russia, he didn't look at Stalin alone in this particular moment when Stalin was running Russia. He looked back 300 years to see what the record was. And it was all black as far as China was concerned, because the Russians had always been biting off hunks of China. So he didn't really trust them very much.
3 months after assuming power, Mao came in person to Moscow to settle matters with Stalin. Top Soviet officials were on parade to greet him, but their master Stalin kept to the background. He neither trusted Mao nor wanted to deal with him, Mao later told his comrades.
第10家爱好和平人民的共同努力，由于中苏两大国的共同威望和亲密合作，特别是由于斯大林大元帅的正确的国际政策，这些任务必将充分实现，并获得良好结果。中苏友好合作万岁！
Mao was to spend nearly 2 months in the Soviet capital. The end result was a treaty of friendship and alliance in which China had to make enormous concessions, not unlike the deals the old imperial China was forced to make with European powers.
There was no man of power with whom Mao quarreled more intensely and over a longer period of time than Stalin. He was in ideological dispute with him because he had a different idea of what China should do in the revolution. And Stalin again and again during Mao's rise attempted to block that rise. When Mao went to Moscow in December of 1949 trying to get a treaty of aid and assistance from Stalin, he finally got it, but it was a piffling treaty. He had a very difficult time. As he told his associates later, Stalin didn't trust him and didn't think he could stay in power. The truth of the matter was that Stalin was probably plotting at that very moment to get him out of power.
Mao had no sooner returned from Moscow when war erupted in Korea. It's most probable that Stalin launched it deliberately in order to obtain Russian domination in Korea and so give him a stranglehold over Peking. Mao sought no conflict with America so soon after coming to power, but China was quickly drawn into war. This was to sow intense hostility between Communist China and the United States for the next 20 years. China's growing military power made her a dangerous neighbor to Russia, especially after she had exploded her first atomic device, and so became the world's 5th nuclear power. After Stalin's death, Khrushchev attempted to improve relations between the Soviet Union and China with an enormous aid program, but he and Mao quarreled about how communist power should be used in the world. The aid program foundered, and relations between Russia and China worsened. The smiles hid fears and hates on both sides. Meanwhile, Mao's old antagonist, Chiang Kai-shek, had retreated to the island of Taiwan with the remnants of his army. Backed by the United States, Chiang maintained that his was the only legitimate government of China. It was Chiang's regime which held the permanent seat of the United Nations Security Council, reserved for China by the Allies in the Second World War. The nationalist presence across the China Sea was a constant threat to Mao's totalitarian claims. Whatever else they might be, the nationalists were certainly Chinese, with myriad ties binding them to their homeland. To the Chinese mind, Russians and Americans were both barbarians, whether you call them communists or capitalists. Mao used his power to extend China's influence towards her traditional frontiers. Tibet was invaded, Indochina infiltrated with communist-inspired guerrillas, Hanoi became a client state, and pressure was extended towards Saigon. The Americans responded with a disastrous war in Vietnam, which they lacked the political will to win. At first, Mao feared that the Americans would attack China, but as this danger receded, it seemed that his policy would more likely lead to a clash with Russia. Mao's youthful dream had been to restore China to her ancient power and dignity. When the President of the United States came in person to Peking, it must have seemed to the aging Mao as though he had achieved the summit of power. When Mao died in September 1976, China experts once again held their breath. Would the power system he had forged die with him?
Mao is dead. His widow and his closest associates, now called a Gang of Four, are in prison. Many aspects of his philosophy are gradually being downplayed, but Mao's spirit will hover over China for centuries to come. This man has changed China, and his successors are not going to change it back. They're going to carry on with a modified form of his philosophy and rule in his name for as long as the regime endures.
Mao may have left chaos behind him inside China, but his thoughts and deeds have changed the way the world looks upon power and its uses.